Welcome to the program. I'm Jeff Schechtman. When longtime journalist and presidential historian Jonathan Alter sat down to write American Reckoning, he couldn't have anticipated how quickly the political landscape would shift. Yet in many ways, this makes his observations even more compelling. Alter, whose previous works have given us deep insights into FDR's first 100 days, the presidency of Jimmy Carter, and the promise of the presidency of Barack Obama, has crafted something different, a personal meditation on democracy, accountability, and the American justice system itself. Writing in what he calls a fever dream during the sweltering summer in a Manhattan courtroom just 25 feet from Donald Trump, Alter witnessed something unprecedented, a former president forced to sit silently as the machinery of justice ground forward. While the political winds have shifted since those dramatic days when the jury foreperson intoned guilty 34 times, Alter's book transcends its immediate context. It's not just about a tawdry case involving hush money payments. It's about what happens when our institutions confront power, when the rule of law meets political reality, and when a journalist with 4 decades of experience covering 9 presidents grapples with his own crisis of faith in the American experiment. From his unique vantage point, as both a child of Chicago politics and a seasoned observer of Washington, Alter gives us something rare in our hyper-partisan times, a deeply personal reckoning with what it means to believe in democratic accountability in an age of democratic decay. Jonathan Alter is a former senior editor and columnist at Newsweek, a longtime political analyst for NBC and MSNBC. He co-produced and co-directed the HBO documentary Breslin and Hamill and writes a weekly Substack newsletter called Old Goats. It is my pleasure to welcome Jonathan Alter back to this program to talk about American Reckoning, inside Trump's trial and my own. Jonathan, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for having me. And that was an extraordinary introduction. I'm blushing. You can't see me, but this I just can't tell you how gratified I am by that introduction because when you write a book, any kind of book, you just want people to have some understanding of what you're trying to do. And I've been, to be honest, I've been worried about whether people would still be interested in this book after the election. And you have described better than I could why my book may have something to contribute to people's thinking. So I'm grateful to you.
Well, thank you very much for those kind words. I truly appreciate it. Let's go back to the beginning of all of this. What was it that was in your thinking when you decided to spend a summer in a New York courtroom watching Donald Trump on trial?
Well, I had been very energized by the January 6th hearings, and I wrote on my Substack newsletter, Old Goats. I wrote every day of those hearings. I'd write a kind of a long piece about what happened that day and how Trump's efforts to stage a coup had failed, and Congress was trying to hold him accountable, even though he had not been convicted in his impeachment trial. And there was all kinds of new evidence coming out in those January 6th hearings. And so what I wanted was to cover the Jack Smith trial in Washington, what would have been, if it hadn't been killed by the election, the most significant trial in American history of a president for trying to overturn the results of an election. And so I got credentialed for that trial in Washington early this year, and was really looking forward to moving to Washington to cover that trial. And then, the immunity business got in the way. And so what was supposed to be a March trial was postponed, and, eventually now it's not going to happen. When that happened, I kind of looked around and at some of the other efforts to hold Trump accountable and realized that my best option was what I call the runt of the litter, the hush money trial in New York. And so I got credentialed for that trial through the magazine that I worked for when I started in journalism, a wonderful little magazine called the Washington Monthly. And because I was the only person representing the Washington Monthly. I didn't have to switch off my seat the way, say, people from the New York Times or the Washington Post, had a bunch of people covering it. And so I got to be in the courtroom every day for the entirety of the trial. And while I was there, the New York Times noticed that I had a permanent seat, which was very, very rare. And they said, well, can you write for us the opinion section? So I wrote for the New York Times from there. But Jeff, I have to tell you that because the trial was not televised, even though it was highly publicized and people think they knew what happened there, they think they know what it was like to see Stormy Daniels testify against Donald Trump and all the rest of it, they really have very little sense of this still historic trial leading to the first conviction of an American president. So I did feel like a kind of almost an historical obligation, because if it wasn't me, you'd have to go back to the transcripts, which nobody does, to get a full sense of what happened in that trial. And it was also, as Andy Cohen, Bravo, said when he had me on last week, it's a dishy book. There's a lot of sex in it, and the trial portions of it are, I think, pretty fun to read, no matter what happens in this case, because Trump is being held accountable, and he's having to sit there and take it day after day after day without being able to change the channel. And he has to listen to the judge. He'd never had to listen to anybody since his father died 40 years ago, and stand up and sit down every time the jury came in or out. And so there was a form of at least provisional accountability there that I found thrilling. And especially when the verdict came back as guilty, I kind of felt a combination of almost a calling to cover the trial, to bear witness, and then also a pleasure in being able to witness what will probably be the only form of accountability that Donald Trump ever sees.
And talk about how you see that today, not the thrill of the experience at that point and Donald Trump facing accountability for the first time, but in the mirror of where we are today. Talk about how you see that.
Well, where we are today is there's news breaking as we speak. So Judge Merchan, right, a very wise judge who presided over this case, just ruled, and this was something that he was requested to do by the prosecution, that he take more time in considering the various factors before he moves on to sentencing. So he was scheduled to sentence Donald Trump on November 26th. But, he has to take account, even the prosecution thinks he needs to take account of how the election results changed that, because as the Justice Department has guidelines that say that a president cannot be prosecuted while he's president of the United States. And then the Supreme Court issued this very significant, I think, horrible decision earlier this year saying that a president couldn't be held accountable for anything he did as president of the United States, legally accountable. So there are these various other sort of legal rulings and guidelines that the judge understandably has to consider. But as the prosecution said in its motion that was filed today, granted that he needed to consider these things, they also said that he needs to consider what it called the regularity of the jury verdict, meaning that the jury's verdict deserves respect as well. And I believe that the judge agrees with that. So I don't know what's going to happen, but my sense is that the most likely outcome is that Judge Merchan rejects Trump's motion to throw the whole thing out, and he sentences him, my guess would be, to probation, with the understanding that his probation would not begin until January 21st, 2029 when he had left office. So my guess is that that's where we're going to end up. And probation, and it might have taken quite a while for the appeals to be exhausted. If Trump had lost the election, he wasn't going to begin serving any sentence until the appeals were finished. So, we might just be, and it was very possible that probation would be all he got since he's a first-time offender. So it may well be that the outcome of this particular case, the only case in which there's any accountability, is a suspended sentence of probation.
You talk about your own crisis of faith, your own concern about the state of American democracy in the context of this story. Talk about how you feel about that today.
Well, I'm alarmed and disturbed and frightened about the short-term and even medium-term future. And I try in the book to stay hopeful about the long-term future. So I believe that in this election, democracy was dented, but it was not destroyed, and that we will experience a pro-democracy movement in this country in the next few years that is similar to pro-democracy movements that have emerged, all over the world in recent years, and then historically after the fall of the Berlin Wall. But you can look in many countries to see the way pro-democracy movements work. It's just a tragic set of circumstances that we need one in this country now, because our nation was founded on an idea. It's not contrary to what J.D. Vance said at the convention, we're not a blood and soil nation. We were founded on an idea, and that idea was democracy and freedom. And the fact that we are now going to be governed by a strong man who admires other strong men and will have, without question, a lawless presidency is traumatizing. But the key lesson, I think, for listeners to take away is that that's what they want. That's what the authoritarians want. They want us to be traumatized. They want us to be paralyzed with dread. They want us to engage in something that was just clarified for me a couple of weeks ago, anticipatory obedience. Right. That's like what Jeff Bezos, the owner of the Washington Post, did when he decided not to endorse Kamala Harris for president. So, but liberals can be subject to anticipatory obedience also. And our obedience, unlike that of people who are just selling out because they want to make sure the government doesn't come after them, or they have contracts that are at stake, our anticipatory obedience takes the form of dread, retreat from the public square, and the worst of all, people talking about leaving the country. And that's what they want. So what we have to do is, after a period of self-care, we have to gird for battle. One hopes it's a nonviolent battle, but struggle, which will take many different forms, and our responsibilities take different shapes. And this is something that I talk about quite a bit in American Reckoning. So my first book was on Franklin Roosevelt's first 100 days, as you mentioned. And at the end of the 100 days, Roosevelt signed a bill called the National Recovery Act. And as part of that, millions of Americans hung a decal in their windows and businesses. And the decal had a blue eagle on it. And underneath it said, "We do our part." So I have a section of American Reckoning called "We Do Our Part," and I try to explore what our part is. So for me, and I think for you, a large part is bearing witness. That's what writers and journalists need to do. That's what we're being called to do. And that's why I wrote the book in the first place, was to bear witness to this trial. For other people, it might be giving money to the pro-democracy movement. It might be, if it comes to this, sheltering an immigrant in your attic. It might be going out into the streets, as most recently, hundreds of thousands of Israelis did when Benjamin Netanyahu took actions that did damage to Israeli democracy. So, all of these things are going to be part of our lives in the next 4 years, but they are the requirements of citizenship. And so part of my cry from the heart in the book was in anticipation of this as a possible result. I got in, and I have the first account of Nancy Pelosi maneuvering Joe Biden off the ticket, but that was only at the very end of my book, because I wanted the book to come out before the election. For most of the time I was working on the book and covering the trial, I actually thought that Biden would lose to Trump. So in many ways, I anticipated this result, and a lot of what I write in the book is in the kind of in the interest of rousing people for the battle to save democracy.
One of the things that you talk about in the book, and that everything you're saying really relates to, and you talk about it as part of growing up in politics and your own experience in Chicago politics, is and something we're not hearing enough about, I would argue today, a longer view of America and American politics, and looking at it as something more than what's happening in the moment and analyzing results before they're all in, but really taking that long historical view and the importance of that in determining what's next.
Yeah, I mean, that's basically what I bring to the party, so and has been for many years. So, I wrote a column in Newsweek at a time when Newsweek was an important magazine for 28 years. And I wrote a column for 20 years. And I worked at Newsweek for 28 years, and as a senior editor and columnist. And so pretty much throughout that period, from the time when I was a really young journalist, I brought history into almost everything that I wrote. And so, if you look at my collection of columns, it's called Between the Lines, you'll see I over and over again go to that. In the book, I describe where I got that perspective. And some of it was from, witnessing history as a child. So Martin Luther King came to our house when I was 8 years old, and when I was 10 years old, I was in the streets of Chicago during the violence during the Democratic Convention, and this relates to stories that I tell about my parents and how political they were. So I had this sense of history and this love of presidents, and I found out everything I could about presidents when I was a kid and memorized them, and had the Gettysburg Address hanging in my room as a child and memorized it. And so I was a history nerd as a kid. And then when I got to high school and college, I was fortunate enough to have teachers who understood how important historical perspective is in analyzing the present. And so I took a class at Harvard from arguably the most distinguished political scientist of the 20th century, a guy named Richard Neustadt, and it was called Thinking in Time, the Uses and Abuses of History. And I went to the lessons from that class over and over again in my writing, and I think I hope I brought it to American Reckoning. You have to have that kind of depth perception in order to, I think, come to conclusions that won't always be right, but at least they'll be informed by historical sensibility. And this was also, in my case, it was helped by the fact that I interviewed 9 of the last 10 American presidents. Reagan's the only one I didn't get to, going back to Nixon, either before, during, or after their presidency. So in Trump's case, it was before his presidency. In the case of Carter and Nixon and Ford, it was after their presidency. And the Bushes, one before, one after, Clinton and Obama, both before, during, and after in both cases. So all of those many interviews, they also informed my understanding of Trump and of the crisis that we face. And they contributed to what you rightly described as my own crisis of faith. The book has a subtitle, After American Reckoning, Inside Trump's Trial and my own trial, my own ordeal is that of losing some faith in the American people, and that maybe was misplaced all along, but I had it. I wasn't naive, but I like to think of myself as John F. Kennedy did, as an idealist without illusions. And I realized that I had more illusions about the good sense of the American people than I thought I did. And I have to now count myself as a disillusioned person.
And one wonders that even with the historical long view of all this, is there something in the zeitgeist of the time, the culture, in communications, media, technology, something that's there today that is anti-historical, that means that the long view may not be relevant to the crisis that we face today?
Well, first of all, I want to take the last of what you said. No, the long view is always relevant. And because you can't give up on trying to improve or at least magnify people's understanding of what's going on in the world. And when you do that, and when you take the long view, you end up hopeful. So I end with, Lincoln's inaugural, and he both in his first inaugural and his second inaugural, he's hopeful. We're on the eve of Civil War, and then we're at the end of Civil War, and he's still hopeful, and that is not misplaced. So, if these other countries can throw off strong men, as has happened all over the world, we can too. And I'm actually rather optimistic about the midterms because, by historical standards, and again, the long view, the party out of the White House always gains, with only 2 exceptions in the last 100 years. The party that does not hold the White House always gains. So I don't think that this is lights out for American democracy. And people who take the long view, who understand history, who understand how bloody and mean so much of our history has been. And I certainly learned this in researching his very best, my Jimmy Carter biography. I learned this anew, to get an understanding of just how cruel Jim Crow was when Carter was a young man. We did not have democracy in the South from the end of Reconstruction until 1965 with the signing of the Voting Rights Act. You had majority black counties where there were no blacks who could vote. That's not democracy. So we've had these challenges to democracy before, and the long view offers hope. So I would say it's more relevant than ever. But to the earlier part of your question, I would say, yes, there have been significant changes in the structure of the media that reward short attention spans, conflict. If you look at something like, Twitter, certainly reward and increase misinformation. And so this is a very, very disturbing part of this election, is that it confirmed that the media that I came out of, the mainstream media, is not dead, but it is substantially reduced, and we're a very long way from a time when we could all agree on a certain set of facts, and Walter Cronkite could end his broadcast saying, that's the way it is, and everybody would agree. Almost everybody would agree that his depiction of reality, while incomplete, was correct. And now we've left what I call the sovereignty of fact, and we're in a world of folk tales where people believe the myths that they want to believe that validate them, and this happens on the left as well. But the ability of the left to communicate has been superseded by the development of right-wing media, which I think has a lot to do with the outcome of this election. There were many voters, low propensity voters, who only vote once every 4 years, don't pay attention to the news, and they didn't even know that, say, General Milley and General Kelly both described Donald Trump as a fascist. And if they did know it, they didn't know what a fascist was. And so, or they were told by the right-wing media that they did absorb and that was driven to their phones that, oh, Trump's already been president. He didn't destroy democracy the first time, so don't worry about it. And so they then paid attention to other issues, whether it be inflation, immigration, or the $100 million that Trump spent telling everybody about Harris's ill-advised endorsement of sex change operations for undocumented prisoners, which is a kind of a trifecta of harm to a campaign, and which she never responded to. So I'm actually not one to dump on Harris. I think she ran an excellent campaign, and she was basically trying to build an airplane when it was already in the sky. But she paid dearly for pandering to the progressives in 2019 when she first was running for president.
And finally, Jonathan, going forward, beyond the big picture, beyond all the things we've been talking about, what are you going to be looking at? What do you want to write about mostly? Where is your focus going to be in the short run, in the next year or two?
So I've been thinking about that a lot. I did want to kind of move away from politics. My next book is about Julius Caesar, a political history of Julius Caesar. So part of my head is very much in the first century BCE. But I've since realized that, I have to put my helmet back on and get back out on the field. I can maybe take a couple of months to chill a little bit, but when the Trump administration starts, I need to pick my battles, not go to the barricades on every bad policy choice. But if and when he runs through the barricades, runs through the guardrails, I have to be there to bear witness to it and to lend my voice, however small it might be. And I think other writers and journalists and podcasters need to do the same thing. So I'm reminded of where American reckoning begins. It begins with the story of my father, my late father, who was a college student at the time of Pearl Harbor. And he enlisted, and he flew 31 harrowing missions in a B-24. He was shot down in Europe. And George H.W. Bush, whom I was very critical of when he was president, but I'm actually a little bit ashamed of some of my criticism, because I criticized him for saying that when he was in the life draft after he had been shot down in the Pacific, that he was thinking about the Constitution. And I kind of snickered at that. He was saying that for political reasons in 1988. I now think that he was serious about this. And he and my father risked their lives to protect democracy. So the least that I and everybody else can do is set aside a little time to be a citizen. And if we happen to be in a profession like journalism, renew our efforts to do what we can to protect the democracy that on which everything else depends. And I think a lot of people don't understand that long term, if we go in this direction, let's say you're just somebody who's an economic person, right? Look at the economy of Russia. If they have now China, you can say, well, that's an exception. But most of these strongman regimes, Venezuela, they're a basket case. It doesn't work for anybody. It doesn't work in terms of foreign policy. It doesn't work in terms of domestic policy. And most important, it doesn't work for which should be the eternal freedom of the people. And so we just have to continue to remind ourselves, Jeff, of the stakes. They continue to be immense. And we all have to decide what we will do to, as FDR said, do our part.
Jonathan Alter, his book is American Reckoning, Inside Trump's Trial and My Own. Jonathan, it is always a pleasure. I thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thanks, Jeff. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.